Welcome. We're joined by Paul Rozenheimer, a German author and journalist from Germany's Bild newspaper. Paul has just returned to Germany after covering the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Paul, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
As I mentioned, you covered the ongoing war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Can you describe your time in Artsakh and the situation there, please?
So I'm a reporter for Bild newspaper, and I've been covering many wars around the world. I was in Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, literally many wars in the past 10 years. But this war in Nagorno-Karabakh, what I've experienced, was one of the most intense ones I've been covering, because we were actually in Stepanakert for many days. I think 6 days we stayed there, day and night. And almost every night we had to stay in cellars because there were sirens outside. Most of the time we couldn't sleep during the night. And what I saw in the city, most of the time we only had 20, 30 minutes to drive around or walk around the city, because the shelling was so intense and everybody had to go to the shelter again. What I saw was a heavily destructed city. I saw buildings, literally totally destroyed. And what you could see was that what was used to destroy these buildings were heavy weapons, heavy artillery, and drones. Actually, I have to say that the drones were the most scary things in Stepanakert. One time during the day, a drone came very, very close to us, and even the noise of this drone is literally terrifying. The situation for civilians on the ground is terrible. Most of them, as we did, stayed in the cellars, in the shelters, in the basements. There is not electricity all the time. No hot water, obviously. People, especially women, are together there. And when you talk to them, they all tell me, I'm not scared about my life, but I'm scared of people who are now in this area, like my husband, my grandson, or my son, who are fighting at the front line.
You mentioned you have covered conflict in eastern Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, and yet you just said that this was some of the most intense military conflict and fighting you have seen. What were the similarities and differences between the Karabakh War and the previous wars you've covered?
Well, I have to say that it was the most intense of civilian shellings I've seen so far, because I can't compare the experience at the front line, because we were only in Stepanakert, so we didn't join military forces at the first line, because also they wouldn't let us. In other conflicts, for example, Eastern Ukraine, I was with soldiers at the very, very front line. This is obviously a different thing. But what makes it so intense and also terrifying is the weapons Azerbaijan uses together with Turkey, the drones from Israel. And it's just, you can see the level of destruction is so intense that if a rocket falls down on the house you're in, the whole house is destroyed, and probably you're not even safe in a cellar. So it's more psychological safety there. Also, we were in the church in Shushi after the first attack, and I was there to film everything together with my colleague Yorgos Moutafis, who's joining me as a cameraman and photographer. And just 45 minutes after we left this church, it was target a second time, where a Russian colleague was heavily injured. So you could also see that the situation for journalists was very dangerous, or is very dangerous. We know about the 2 colleagues from French media who were injured, but I don't want to talk too much about journalists, because it's our job. I want to talk more about the civilians. And if you see that, it has a big impact. And if a city like Stepanakert is being shelled and churches are being shelled, it shows that there is not only military targets which are attacked by the Azerbaijani side, although we have to say also colleagues from Azerbaijan report that in Ganja also civilians were targeted by Armenian military.
Could you speak on the interactions you had with the inhabitants of Nagorno-Karabakh and maybe speak a bit on their mood and constitution, especially with regards to the other conflicts you covered and the inhabitants in those zones of conflict?
Well, what I can tell you, if I would, for example, compare it to eastern Ukraine, the people, the civilians are more experienced in a way in terms of war, because most of them still remember the war, the wars before in 2016, although which wasn't as bad as it is now, but also in 1992, so the whole family most of the time has a history of being impacted by this war. So you could see that they're scared, yes, but at the same time they would tell you that they're proud of their sons, their grandsons, and so on, to defend their country. And you could see that they were still very, very welcome to foreigners like me, although they were in a terrible situation. They would offer food in their shelters and basements, and they were very open about telling their story and telling how it feels to be attacked again as a civilian in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Well, you mentioned that many journalists and civilians have been exposed to danger, but I'm curious, as a journalist and with regards to Armenian and Artsakh authorities, did you feel free to report as you pleased?
I was kind of free in reporting, although at the beginning there was from the press center, they would tell us that one of them would join us through driving through the city. But on the second or third day, we were going around alone. We were open to talk to all the civilians we found. The only problem was to talk to military people on the ground, and also there's a problem of joining the front line. This is different than I experienced it in other wars. So, for example, in Ukraine, especially at the beginning, you were able to also see what is happening in the first line of conflict, so in the very front line. Also in other conflicts, like in Syria, the war against ISIS, and in Afghanistan, obviously, with the international army. So that was a bit of problem of, I mean, for me, I wanted to focus on the civilian side anyway, but other journalists tried to go to the front line, and this was not accepted by the Armenian army.
Well, Paul, thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.